Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this event hosted by Iceland Naturally and the Icelandic Art Center. My name is Auður Jörundsdóttir, and I'm the director of the Icelandic Art Center. With me here today are Markus Thor Andresson, Chief Curator at the Reykjavik Art Museum, Tina Rivers-Ryan, Curator at the Albright-Knox Museum, and Gregory Volk, Writer and Curator. I want to thank them for taking the time for joining us today and share their insights into the Icelandic art scene. We will open up for questions at the end, so you are all welcome to post questions into the Q&A function. I hope you will all enjoy the talk. And now Tina will take over.
Great. Thank you so much, Auður, for the invitation to be here today and to speak about Icelandic art, which is one of my new favorite subjects. As Auður mentioned, I am a curator at the Albright-Knox Art Gallery in Buffalo, New York. And while I am not technically a curator of media art here, I do have a special interest in time-based media art, digital art. And for those of you who know a little bit about contemporary Icelandic art, you know that media and performance are among its major themes or its hallmarks. And as I understand it, I think this has something to do with the strong musical and literary traditions in Iceland, but perhaps that's something that Markus can speak more about later. So, of course, I've taken a particular interest in Icelandic art, and I was actually lucky enough to make it over to Reykjavik in 2019. It was one of my last trips. It was actually my last international trip before COVID to attend the Sequences Festival there. Sequences was started in 2006 by some of the leading arts institutions there. If you have had the chance to watch the new series of videos that have been organized about the Icelandic art scene, you might recall that Doro Kurch talks about Sequences, I think, in the 3rd episode of those videos. But the subtitle of Sequences is Real-Time Art Festival. And that's because it, was really founded to promote media art and sort of the time-based arts. And actually, just before we started this panel, I was speaking with the Icelanders who confirmed that, in fact, Sequences was the very first visual arts festival in Iceland. And I think it's incredibly telling about the nature of Icelandic art that their first visual arts festival was, in fact, one devoted to media art. And so what you're seeing here on the screen was a musical performance from the opening night of Sequences at Marshall House, which also is a space that was mentioned in those videos. And this particular artist, I'm going to try to pronounce her name correctly, Þórarna Björnsdóttir, had a fantastic live musical performance that was broadcast through headphones. I enjoyed it very much. And it turns out that she's actually curating the next edition of Sequences, which will be this fall. Pandemic willing. The focus in Icelandic art on temporality, on performance, on media is nothing new. It goes back to at least the 1960s, when the Icelandic artist Steina helped pioneer the field of video art. Steina, I'm just going to briefly introduce you to her because I don't think you can talk about Icelandic art with talking about Steina, although of course I'm a bit biased. So Steina trained as a musician and then married the filmmaker Woody Vasulka, and they moved to New York City. And together they made many early experiments with video technologies and even co-founded the space The Kitchen in New York City, which remains one of the most important spaces for avant-garde art. In the 1970s, Steina and Woody actually lived and taught here in Buffalo. And I'm proud to say that in 1978, the Albright-Knox Art Gallery, where I'm a curator, hosted what I believe was their first museum show. And so you see here a photo of this incredible installation, and we have these amazing archival photos. And you can see that basically this work called Machine Vision comprised a mirrored ball in the middle of the room that had 2 cameras, like closed circuit TV cameras, pointing at it, which then fed live images to the monitors at the perimeter of the room. So essentially, this work is establishing some of the major themes that we will see in early video art, including liveness and the openness or indeterminacy of the work of art. So including the audience as part of the work so that the image will continually evolve. And also perceptual confusion or disorientation, and finally surveillance. So Steina is a hugely important artist in the history of video art, and also I think one of the most emblematic of Icelandic's contemporary artists. So when I was in Reykjavik attending sequences, I did have the chance to conduct some studio visits, including one with Finnbogi Pétursson, who is an artist who works with light and sound. And you see here one of his installations at the Reykjavik Art Museum's Harbor House. So this is just to say that, you know, the interest that Steina represents definitely continue through contemporary Icelandic art. Here you see another installation, and I apologize, the image is a bit low quality, but here's another installation by Finnbogi called Surveillance. And of course, with these cameras in a circle facing each other, I can't help but think of Steina's machine vision. And I'm not sure if it was an intentional homage, but I do like to think of these as being in conversation. And then the last artist I want to talk about briefly to sort of get our conversation about Icelandic art going is Ólafur Eliasson. So of course, art that deals with temporality almost necessarily deals with perception. And so perception is another major theme in Icelandic art. And in Ólafur's work, we see how perception for Icelanders is so intimately tied to the landscape. You know, Iceland is obviously an incredible landscape that's quite severe and beautiful. You have the black lava fields, you have the steaming lagoons, you have the aurora borealis. And Iceland is also, you know, geologically quite young. I mean, it looks sort of primordial, but it's actually very young land and it's still forming. And so I think a lot of Icelandic art has something to do with what it means to be situated inside of a changing landscape, thinking about landscape either literally or just sort of metaphorically. And at the Albright-Knox, we have a significant collection of works by the Danish Icelandic artist, Ólafur Eliasson, and I'm showing you here a series of photos from 1998 that really captures the experience of being inside the landscape. So here you're literally inside of these caves, looking out at various atmospheric conditions. Of course, many of Eliasson's works are about exactly this, about experiencing yourself, experiencing changing atmospheric conditions. So here's another work from our collection from 2004, which is a motorized kinetic sculpture that activates the darkened room with lights and shadows. And conceptually, it's quite simple, but phenomenologically, it's really complex and beautiful and kind of haunting. It's like one of my favorite works in our collection. And so finally, I'll just wrap up by saying that, you know, well, as some of you may know, perhaps not all of you, here in Buffalo, we are currently in the midst of a major expansion on our campus, which will add a third building and also double our exhibition space. And as part of this project, which we call AK360, we are currently working with Eliasson and Sebastian Behmann of Studio Other Spaces to create this artwork called Common Sky that will essentially cover over the courtyard of our 1962 building that was designed by Gordon Bunshaft of SOM. So we're incredibly excited about working with him on this and about bringing this work to Buffalo. And we hope that it will be a prelude to further collaborations with Icelandic artists. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Markus.
Thanks, Tina. And thank you everybody for being with us and thanks for your interest in good old Iceland. We are here in Reykjavik. I'm sitting in the Reykjavik Art Museum where I hold the position of Chief Curator of Exhibitions and Public Engagement. I've been here for around 5 years and before that I've been curating and writing independently and working on documentaries and TV shows on contemporary art. All in all, working quite a lot with Icelandic artists and within the Icelandic art scene and abroad. And just for introduction's sake, like you're doing, Tina, just a couple of slides to get things going. And you know, in so many places, not only in Iceland, contemporary art is owing a lot to the avant-garde of the 60s and 70s. And I think it's great that Tina started out by mentioning key figures such as Steina and the Razulkas, who have had a major influence on the development of new media art. So I'd also like to mention other major representatives of different avant-garde movements who have contributed to the scene that we know today. So mentioning Errol here with his Foodscape from 1964, somebody who has quite a lot of influence. He is turning 90 next year, so we're going to celebrate his birthday with a huge retrospective here at the museum, traveling show that's going to go from here to Moscow and then to Denmark and who knows where. His art is, you know, based in pop art, in narrative figuration, appropriation, so it's like very postmodern. Hreinn Friðfinnsson, who is on our next slide, is an excellent example of the conceptual art movement, how it traveled to Iceland. It took a very poetic streak He is also thinking about nature and landscape, but in a very different way from his predecessors who were painting landscape. He's more thinking about how he experiences art, how he positions himself in nature. So Friðfinnsson, a very important key figure from the 60s and 70s. Magnús Pálsson, I bring him in just as an example of how Fluxus played a huge role in the Icelandic art scene. This was partly through the influence of Dieter Roth, who lived here extensively in Iceland, and so Magnús Pálsson was influenced by him and continued to work in this Fluxus-oriented practice, process, language, theater, performance. And then finally, Rúri, a veteran of performance art and sort of, somebody who really started focusing on social critique. And all these artists and many more, they represent movements which are very important to the art scene as we know it today. And we can talk about just a couple of artists who are working internationally who draw a lot from this generation, such as Ragnar Kjartansson, obviously, who is taking on postmodern appropriation, process, performance, and so he's an artist who's fundamentally a driving force in analyzing or deconstructing the making of and the reception of art, be it visual arts or music or theater or film or television or literature, like in this work in particular, World Light, where he's referencing a novel by Halldór Laxness, a major project commissioned by TVA 21. And then another artist working internationally who I'd like to mention is Katrín Sigurðardóttir, who works on sculpture and installation. And here's an artist who's working with conceptual ideas on the perception of time and distance, memory and space, merging beautifully the notion of the local and the global and the personal and the general. So it's very much in the spirit of these poetic conceptual works that I mentioned before. Here's a work that she did for the Metropolitan Museum, where she's sort of redesigning a room that's on display there. So there's a lot of great artists that I could mention, and they work with and use a lot of these ideas that come from the 60s and in the 70s. But to cut a long story short, I also have to turn things around, because it's Icelandic art. You cannot talk about it without talking about the influence that comes from abroad. This is, like I mentioned, Dieter Roth coming here in the 60s had a huge influence, and there were so many artists that came from internationally who to study here or to teach here or to collaborate with Icelandic artists to study the Icelandic landscape. They just may have gotten a cheap ticket with Icelandair, crossing over the Atlantic Ocean, stopping by, for 5 days or something. But all this had a big influence on the scene here. People are always thirsty for something new, and this conversation, this dialogue between the Icelandic and the international art scene is very important and still is. So we try to maintain this tradition here in the museum. We have like a venue for younger upcoming artists, and we try to include the international artists who drift up north and study here in the MA program of the Icelandic Art Academy. So we have a series of upcoming artists showing in this D Gallery series. We have done this since 2007, and we have more than 40 artists taking part, and Andreas Brunner, also in this case from Switzerland, a great example of an international artist who is settling here in Iceland and making a big influence on the scene here. Another project we're working on here in the museum, upcoming for the summertime, is a big show of maybe the next generation, a bit older, people in the 30s and early 40s, people who have sort of fallen in between worlds, partly analog, partly digital. So we're trying to look at 14 artists from this generation here in Iceland who have witnessed, two worlds. And Arna Óttarsdóttir is an example of this, who is, going back to old traditions of craft and textiles, while being very firmly in her digital contemporary art environment, as you can see in this great example. Recent work by her. And then I wanted to mention, if we go a generation up, we have a series of retrospectives or mid-career retrospectives, and this is the artist we're working with now in the fall, Guðný Rósa Ingimarsdóttir, an excellent example of a person who was working very much with her hands, very much appropriating stuff, copy paste a little bit, taking from Arrow, but also the poetic side from Hreinn Friðfinnsson, and the crafty work of the 60s and 70s. Very poetic, very subtle. We look forward to doing this show with her in the fall. And finally, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the project we're working on next year, which is an international collaboration. This is a project with a working title North Atlantic Triennial. And this is a show opening in Portland Museum of Art in Maine, early 2022. It's going to travel here to Iceland and then moving over to Sweden, Bildmuseet in Umeå. And this is a project that aims to create a new kind of center based around the North Atlantic region or the Arctic region, where we are taking in artists who are looking at the changes that are happening in society and nature and climate with a very personal story to tell. And Anna Lindahl is one of those people who's been studying the way scientists are researching the changes happening in our nature. And she does it very much in her own style. So here's just a couple of examples of artists that I wanted to throw out there for conversation later. And of course, I'm missing out on a bunch of great artists, but you know how it is. We can't include everybody at the same time. So over to you, Gregory.
Hi to everybody, and it's wonderful that you're here, and I'm pleased to be here as well. It so happens that in this pandemic time, my very first trip outside of the United States is going to be to none other than Reykjavik in just a couple weeks, and where I will go to write about 2 exhibitions. The one group show that Markus just talked about at the Reykjavik Art Museum, and the next one by the artist whose work you can see here now, Ragnar Robertsdottir. But first, just like a little brief, I'm an art writer, occasional curator based in New York City, writing for Hyperallergic, long time for Art in America, and many other things. But every now and then, it's been my experience that I have been favored to experience in the art world, because of the art world, life-changing things. And for me, my first trip to Iceland in 1999 was one of those trips. I landed in Keflavik and felt curiously, oddly at home in a completely alien, bizarre landscape for me, like Mars with oxygen, but it felt just so good and right to be there. I went to Reykjavik to write a catalog essay about Ragnar Robertsdottir, who you see here now. And I also got, one of the few times I've gotten a great idea, I also got an idea to combine this catalog essay with writing a big article for Art in America, a survey of contemporary art then. So while I was in Reykjavik for over two different times in August and November, I had 30 or 40 studio visits, which was just so wonderful, resulting in that article. So Ragnar Robertsdottir works with what Jane Bennett has called in her great book, Vibrant Matter, vital materialities. She works with, this might look like a painting for those of you who don't know her work, but it's actually lava. It's lava chips glued to the wall. And she makes these works by mapping out a section of the wall and just flinging handfuls of lava at it. Much of it sticks, some of it falls. And then she sometimes uses tweezers to just slowly, patiently develop the whole work. In the meantime, she's working with traces of whopping forces, the volcanoes, which are right now erupting quite a lot in Iceland. And the reason I went there, I realized I could not write about her adequately without going with her out to the landscapes that matter so much to her, that mean so much to her. So I went on a studio visit, say, to Hekla, the famous volcano, and way out to the highlands. Okay, next slide. In more recent works by her, once again, extremely elemental, as she's just working with ocean salt or black lava salt glass, water, and she can't totally control how these works look because she just makes this event and the water evaporates and what's left is the image. I love it. It's like molecular, it's cosmic. And just she's so connected to working like with the vital materials of her country, working, not making representations of nature, landscape painting, but working with the land itself. And that's one thing I've totally seen, and what's so important is how significant the Icelandic nature, volatile Icelandic landscape is for so many artists there. And by the way, also for me, I'm proud to report that I've twice hiked the world famous Reykjavík Trail. And I've also been backpacking in one of the most remote parts of Iceland, which is Hornstrandir in the northwest. So the Icelandic nature is extremely important to me, as it is to this fantastic artist in her early 70s who deserves much greater recognition. She has it in Iceland and a lot in Europe, but in my opinion, much more. There's a visionary artist working with nature in this way. Okay, next. When I was in Reykjavik for my very first time, I met Birgir Andresson, who is a legendary figure. I think that Markus would agree with me about this. An incredibly important, excellent artist working in many different genres and mediums, and who died way too early. I'm convinced that Birgir Andresson, had he left Iceland and made his career in another, much more visible place, Germany or continental Europe or the United States, I'm convinced he would be understood to be one of the great artists of the era. But he didn't make a mistake, because Iceland was his home and it was both his subject and muse. So he needed Iceland. And so he worked in many different ways, including these text pieces, but they have a certain fascinating history. He was born in the Westman Islands, which is off the south coast of Iceland, and grew up as a sighted person in a home for the blind, so his blind father and blind stepmother. So from an early age, he was explaining the world in precise, vivid terms to them, and that acuity with language, that precision, is exactly what would come into his language portraits later. Okay, next slide. And also, Markus could talk more about this later, but he also, Birgir Andresson also had a real sense of humor, and so he invented his own sort of like fake color scheme, Pantone color system, in which he named specific colors as like absolutely Icelandic colors, although of course those colors could be anywhere. And he gave them names, but such great names. For example, as you see here, pouring rain, blackest night. It's like in these two wall paintings, it's like creates an entire scene, a very Icelandic scene. It could be the beginning of a saga. It's totally connected to nature. And even though there's something very humorous about taking this kind of black or this kind of greenish color and saying it's specifically Icelandic, I mean, of course it's not. But when you're in Iceland, you realize that these colors are very much connected to Iceland, including the outside of the corrugated outsides of the houses in the old part of Reykjavik and many other places throughout the country. Okay, next slide. And this is something that's fascinating to me, maybe also because I'm from the US, but like the US art scene is actually really connected in fundamental ways with Iceland, and because some of the really great artists from the last several decades were deeply engaged with Iceland. Donald Judd, for example, Lawrence Weiner, for example. None more so than Ronnie Horn, who started going to Iceland as soon as she graduated from Yale, if not before, and who's been going back repeatedly, deeply understands the country, has influenced her enormously. And this is, I'm showing just one image of her great, great work called Library of Water in the west part of Iceland, in the West Fjord, in Stykkishólmur. And there's 24 glass cylinders filled with water from Iceland's melting glaciers, a work way back then, 2007, which is very much responding to Iceland in a time of global warming and crisis. There's words on the floor which people have given that refer to the weather being something crucial for Ronnie Horn. And when you're there, there's something, it's also something so magical because it's a little town and outside is the giant water, the giant ocean. So you're looking through water at water and as light slants through these columns. So the impact of Iceland on Ronnie Horn, but also on so many other artists is crucial. Okay, I'll end with that. Thank you so much. And now we can talk together. Okay, so I just have a quick question. Do you want to say something about Birgit first, Markus?
No, well, thank you just for your great presentation. I mean, these are excellent examples. I totally get where you're coming from with this. And Birgit is somebody who we are very much admire, and I could just add that we are working on a big show of his work coming up next year, and curated by Robert Hobbs, and it's going to be followed by a nice substantial catalog. So really very much forward to that. And I did work with him on several occasions when he was alive, and you're absolutely right. He's a key figure here in Iceland because he's dealing with national identity, national heritage, but not in this nationalistic way, but in this humorous, sort of quirky, deconstructing way that is a very, basic case study that could apply anywhere in the world. Taking what you get from your ancestors, which is either overlooked or scorned or maybe praised, hysterically too much, and putting it on a level where things are, human and understandable. Did that beautifully.
Great. Okay, so I have a question for everyone, just to get us talking. Why should say North Americans, it could be from anywhere, but why should North Americans, what might North Americans, art enthusiasts, museum people, anyone like that might have to learn from art produced in Iceland? And by the way, Iceland does not have a long history in terms of visual art. Maybe Markus could, but art in Iceland is essentially close to a 20th century enterprise for a lot of complex reasons. But what might we have to learn from art produced in this small but powerful country of 350,000 people or so? I mean, there's more artists in my neighborhood in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, than probably more visual artists than in all of Iceland. So what could we possibly have to learn? And the second part of that question is like, why are the two of you, and myself included, so engaged with Iceland? What's important, unique about the art from this country?
Well, it's difficult when you're in the midst of the storm, but judging from raising children, at least you can see something happening there, that it's just the right conditions, and you don't necessarily create those conditions. They happen accidentally. And I think what happened to the Icelandic art scene when it was developing, that it had the appropriate amount of disinterestedness. People were not interested. They didn't the artists were allowed to just run their own artist-run business and doing art for each other. They were not doing it for the market. They were not doing it for the critics. It was just a very self-contained scene for a very long time, maybe for exactly the appropriate amount of time. And this just created a very, very fertile ground. And as I said in my introduction, I think we have to sort of nod to those generations of people who paved the way with doing their thing for zero interested people, and the museums didn't collect their works, they weren't bought, they weren't shown. So these people the avant-garde artists who had this time to play around, and then they hand this over to the next generation, which has then a certain kind of freedom that maybe is on a different level than you have in other societies. And this is, as I say, it's difficult to repeat this. This is just something that happened, and this wouldn't happen today. I mean, here in Iceland, we have a perfect art university. We have published our art history. We have galleries, international galleries. We have collectors and we have museums and God knows what. And we're just like any other town in Sweden, for that matter. So it's just a point in time where the situation was good. And then another point that you take is the environment. Like Tina was saying, Oliver Eliasson mentions it, that it's the changing landscape that has an influence. And I guess I have to, as much as it's a cliche for us here in Iceland, there is a truth to it. The changing weather, the changing landscape, the changing, there's a freaking volcanic eruption here outside my window. So, these changes, they do have an influence on how you perceive, how you connect with your environment. And I guess to a certain extent, this is what comes through the artwork that we see.
Yeah, and to Gregory's question, I think that's actually one reason, like that's one answer to the question of why Icelandic art might be interesting to people who are outside of Iceland. It's the relationship, the sort of understanding of ecology and the relationship to the landscape. I mean, in this moment of extreme climate change, when we are all having to think in a much more deliberate way about our relationship to the environment, and we're talking about things like the Anthropocene and trying to understand how we ourselves can both on a personal level and a societal level reimagine our relationship to nature, understanding that there's actually an imperative to do that, or we're not going to survive as a species. I think in Iceland, I mean, as you said, it's a bit of a cliche, but there is some truth to it. I mean, you're literally living under an exploding volcano right now, which just seems like this amazing, I mean, it has nothing to do with climate change, but it's this amazing, very concrete representation of what it means to be living in a climate that is in some ways sort of inhospitable and hostile. And the way that artists can sort of open our eyes to seeing that landscape around us and to learn how to sort of live with it, to find beauty in it. I just think that there's a model there that we all could be looking towards. So, and then Gregory, for the second part of your question, it was why we individually are interested in Iceland or Icelandic art.
What?
Yeah, why are we all here? That's something.
No, like what drew you to Iceland originally?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I tried to already sort of answer this when I was trying to give a sort of art history 101 overview to like what exactly are the major themes and movements within contemporary Icelandic art. But yeah, for me, it's really the media. I mean, I'm very drawn, like when you think of, okay, well, who are the sort of major contemporary Icelandic artists that, most people in the art world could name? They're all people who work with time, with perception, and those are absolutely just personally my interests. It was only when I got to Iceland that I understood that actually there's also, I'm also very sympathetic to a kind of mood there. Like Markus was mentioning, there's a sense of humor in Icelandic art. Mm-hmm. But Icelandic art is also very metal, like sort of like goth and like very intense and kind of romantic. Like there's a lot of interest in the sublime, like some of these notions still pertain there. But at the same time, there's also this attitude of sort of like not taking oneself too seriously and being very playful. And I love that. Those sort of two poles of being very open to like these sort of existential questions and to the notion of the sublime, and then also, making wordplay. And it's, again, that's something that I didn't, like the mood, I didn't quite understand until I got there and started speaking with artists and myself understood the landscape. And having your first visit to Iceland in October, I feel like is kind of the perfect time, actually. Like it was a bit gray, it was a bit cold, it was a bit wet, it was a bit, a bit dramatic. So those would be my answers to those questions, which are great questions.
But this point you're making, Tina, is something that is interesting because it comes from the visitor's eye, and just recently we're publishing a magazine of Icelandic art just for the local art scene, and there was an article in there by a young artist, a woman from France, Claire Pogam, who was asking this question about the playfulness in Iceland. I mean, she just comes like you from abroad and sees what's happening, and she immediately jumps on this. Why is Icelandic art so playful? Why don't they take themselves more seriously? It's playful in the sense of throwing things out there that are maybe not completely finished. It's raw. It's childish, naive, funny in that sense. It's slapstick, and it's maybe avoids it. Maybe to some extent it avoids clear references to serious subjects, issues of the day or such. So this is something that she noted in her article, and I find it interesting that you also mentioned this.
That is interesting. But one thing I would also add, and this gets a little like risky, is that in my experience, I don't mean to sum up all of Icelandic art. I mean, that's like ridiculous. But I think that there's something in the art that I cherish from Iceland. There's something very soulful and oftentimes frankly emotional, like not shying away from being that frankly emotive, emotionally engaged work in the work itself, but also the artist. That's certainly what I experienced meeting Birgir Andresson and Ragnar Robesdotter and Ragnar Kjartansson or Jansi. There's this ability to deal in like core level complicated human matters and emotions in a sophisticated way with art. And I'll just like have one like brief little story. Like a while ago, Ragnar Kjartansson had this fantastic exhibition. Probably many of you who are on this Zoom talk saw The Visitors, either at Loring Augustine or wherever you saw it. And so I wrote about that exhibition amazing exhibition for Art in America. And I think I went like 3 or 4 times, taking the whole 64 minutes or more. It's so mean. And then I finally finished my text and sent it off, and I was like, well, I'm just going to go back one more time because I'm going to miss this show. And so I went back, and it had been extended at the gallery. And so I went back. I took one step into the gallery and burst into tears in completely involuntary way. I wasn't expecting this to happen at all. This doesn't usually happen for me as an art writer who's seen hundreds of exhibitions, but it certainly happened then. And I think it's because of this soulfulness and this depth of this emotional intensity of the work, of that great work, which is humorous, which is whoppingly sad, which is cosmic, which is tender, all of these things at the same time. And I think that's a quality, and that soulfulness is something that I very much responded to. Tina, you also mentioned Finnboy Peterson. He's exactly like that for me.
I think I was trying to use the word romantic, but to describe exactly what you're saying, and maybe soulful is the better word. But there's a sense of being willing to experience emotions and to sort of inhabit them. And I wonder actually if, in the wake of this pandemic, and it feels very premature to say wake when you consider what's going on right now around the world.
Yeah,
but
good point.
But if we can imagine at some point there will be a future in which the great reckoning will happen, and we will have to think about, not only like, oh, what has the art world or what has the pandemic meant for the art world, but just what has the pandemic meant for like human civilization, and all of us sort of processing what it's been like to live through this moment, like this world historical moment. I wonder if art that can accommodate these kinds of sort of big feelings will feel even more sort of relevant and urgent. So anyway, that was just one thought I had thinking about what you said. But speaking of COVID, now that I've brought that up, I actually, Markus, I love how you mentioned like the cheap Iceland air flights. that would sort of facilitate this like cross-cultural exchange. And that just got me thinking about this moment in which so many of us have been grounded. So for example, I was supposed to go back to Iceland. So I was in Iceland for sequences in October of 2019. And then I was supposed to go back in April of 2020 to do some more studio visits, which I was very much looking forward to. And then that trip, of course, got canceled because of COVID. And hopefully, you know, I'll be able to make it back and make that happen at some point. But you know, what do you think? I'm just curious. I mean, being an island country, now that so much of the art world is talking about shifting away from art fairs and shifting away from international travel, partly because of the ecological cost, and shifting instead towards digital events and digital sales, what impact do you think that might have on Iceland's art scene, given that so much of it has been dependent upon the sort of cheap and frequent, you know, transoceanic travel?
Well, I do think that you know, times are different. Today we have our society is so much more mixed than it was before, and we have so many people just living here on a permanent basis from everywhere. So we have a huge just influx that's steady at the moment, stuck on the island. So we do have shows coming up from minority groups that are very, you know, interesting and upcoming people who have settled here in Iceland and made Iceland their home. So this is something that continues to inspire the country and be seen. And so you don't necessarily need to have the constant in and out travel of people, but you can also create projects that can travel. And we here at the museum are trying to do that, to create exhibitions that can go abroad and internationally, and you know, vice versa. Try to have connections and professional relationships with institutions on collaborative projects that can happen. I mean, this project I mentioned before, the North Atlantic Triennial, we haven't met at all. We haven't met any artists. We're just doing it online, and it's working fine. Well, let's wait and see until the show opens. But at least I think it's possible to do this like that. And I think there are just different ways about things today. And I know people are preparing shows internationally without being able to travel, and it's going fine. And I'm sure you have similar stories to tell in your situations.
Mm-hmm. Does the museum do you have a lot of relationships with museums outside of Iceland?
Well, it's sort of coming along. I guess the COVID pandemic sort of kicked us in the ass in that sense to think more about that. I mean, we have been focusing quite a lot on the local scene, just with the programming that's going on this year. But behind the scenes, we're trying to increase our relationship internationally, just to be able to, you know, when everything is over and done with the situation, we can start collaborating and opening up to projects that will come in and leave us and go to other places. So hopefully that's a positive thing that might come out of this.
I'll just briefly interject here to remind everyone who's listening along that we are happy to take some questions, especially not since you have Markus here with you and also Gregory, and both of these people being, you know, very much embedded in Icelandic art. So if you guys want to use the Q&A feature to ask any questions, we're happy to tackle those. Otherwise, we could just keep talking. We've been doing this now for a couple months and we could keep going. I know, for example, that one thing that we've been chewing over is the kind of paradox of thinking about Icelandic art as an entity, as, you know, a construction, when in fact so much of contemporary art now has become globalized and is now about kind of moving beyond nationalistic borders and boundaries, you know, for myriad reasons, and we can debate whether or not that's a good thing. But yeah, to be talking about Icelandic art in a way seems sort of like perversely old-fashioned. And so I just wondered if we could all talk a little bit more about that. I'm curious to know, you know, both Markus and Gregory, what your thoughts are.
I do agree that. Sorry, yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
No, it's definitely something that if you talk to Icelandic artists, they're all pretty much afraid of this stamp of the Icelandic artists and the cliche of the, well, loving nature and being inspired by nature and being drunk all the time and not being able to express emotions unless in your artwork and whatnot. But again, the cliche is oftentimes based on a certain truth, and people play with this cliche also. They put on an act, and this is something that the future generations will probably continue to deconstruct and play with. I mean, we talked about Birgir in the beginning, who was doing nothing but breaking down cliches and making fun of such ideas of something being Icelandic by choosing typically Icelandic colors. So it's similarly ridiculous to talk about typically Icelandic artists, I guess. But maybe through the eye of somebody who comes from afar and then sees the art scene, there are elements that are repeated, like we've been talking about, the playfulness, nature and a certain kind of humor, and then of course there's a range of things that break those rules and do something completely different, and we would never probably categorize them as typically Icelandic. They're more in line with the international art scene in some senses.
And speaking of that, Gregory, I don't want to preempt you answering this question, but one of the questions that has come in is about galleries in New York City or the US that promote Icelandic artists. And they mentioned Luring Augustine representing Ragnar Kjartansson. So also I want to mention Tanya Banagdar representing Olafur Eliasson. And also there are amazing galleries in Iceland that I have encountered many times at art fairs as well as in Reykjavik. So I8 Gallery and Berg Contemporary are two galleries that come to mind. And so they're based in Iceland, but they, we'll see what the art world looks like after COVID, but at least before COVID, they would bring works to fairs regularly. I saw an amazing installation by I8 of work by Woody Vasilka at the Armory show, actually. So, they're sort of bringing artists who are Icelandic or Icelandic adjacent to international attention. Another question that came in that I just wanted to highlight real quick here, because I'm curious to know more about what Markus and Gregory would have to say to this. The question is, what are the major socio-political themes that new generation artists are grappling with in Iceland? And I wanted to draw out this question because it actually relates to something that came up earlier, but I didn't follow up on. So Markus, when you were saying that this other, woman who was looking at Iceland from the outside said that, the work is very playful and sort of maybe doesn't tackle, these troubling issues, I made a little face because I was thinking in my mind of being in Reykjavik and seeing all of the art that was basically about the 2008 financial crisis and the housing crisis, like artists who are working with corrugated steel, artists who are making drawings of abandoned, homes that were, left mid-construction when, Iceland got hit terribly hard in that crisis. So if you just wanted to answer this question, I'd be curious to know what are some of the major themes that artists are dealing with. I know for myself, I saw that sort of international finance and the vulnerability of Iceland within the international global financial community was something that I noticed.
Yeah, you're spot on there, Tina. That was a big issue at the time, and certainly many artists took part in that whole discourse. Prior to that, in the first decade of this century, I'd say artists had a huge impact on the discourse around how we are dealing with our nature in terms of either protecting it for future generations or making some sort of use of it. And in this case in particular, there was the question of flooding a huge highland area to create a hydroelectric power plant. And when it came to discussing this, the public was pretty much oblivious about this because people hadn't gone there, they hadn't seen these parts, and then the artists took it on themselves to go up there, to take people up there, to make photographs, to send photographers up there and to really make the public aware of this. So they really changed the discourse, I must say, a huge influence there. The financial crash, that was true. And then there is this critique on the society as it is constructed today. I mean, it is in many senses stagnant. It is old-fashioned. It is pretty much focused on the local. We are very new to how to deal with immigrants and people from other areas of the world living here with us. These are all upcoming issues that you see brewing with younger artists. How are we tackling situations like class? We've always sort of prided ourselves here in Iceland that there's no class system. Everybody's equal. And artists are taking part in sort of deconstructing that myth and pointing to the obvious that we have as much a class system here as anywhere else, if not more. It's just hidden in different ways. So revealing those class structures and those old-fashioned silos that make up our society is definitely something that you see among those artists who are dealing with more socio-political issues.
I'd like to respond gently to take issue with one aspect of that question. What are the major socio-political themes that new generation artists are grappling with? It seems to me that some of the things that we've talked about, like for example, I talked about Ragnar Róbersdóttir working with ocean salt and lava. That's not a romantic vision of nature. That's like working directly with a living landscape. And I can't imagine something more significant in a socio-political sense right now than artworks that are deeply and profoundly engaged and questioning of the relationship that humans have with nature, based on millennia of understanding that we are somehow separate from nature and that lords and masters of it, all complete and total nonsense. And that's this kind of fallacious understanding is now looking like not only ridiculous, but potentially lethal. So what some of, like, so when Finnboy Peterson that Tina talked about is making artworks that utilize the sounds, the actual sounds of the earth. I think that's a profoundly socio-political approach. In addition to many other elements of such a work, renegotiating our relationship from a non-human centric perspective with nature, I think is like fundamental. And I would just wonder why that's not done so much more in like my city of New York. Why is that not much more? But that should be a lot more prevalent in the art world here, in my opinion, not just on, not in. So I would just question that, like what I'm perceiving as a separation between socio-political and nature, which I don't see any separation between the two at all. Does that make sense?
I think you're on the right track there. It's a very good point, Gregory, that you make, and that maybe many good contemporary artists in Iceland are doing exactly this. They are helping us experience our environment in a different way, and we're turning the gaze from us versus nature. And I didn't realize, but the work I have here in the background, I'm pointing it to it now, is by one of those artists, Einar Garibaldi. I have to mention this since it's here with me. Einar Garibaldi, this is a sign that you would have typically on a beautiful spot in nature, saying you should stop your car here and you should watch this beautiful landscape. This is an interesting place. So this sign says this is an interesting place. So Einar Garibaldi in this case went to Þingvellir, which is our beautiful national park where you have gorgeous nature and important history. And he, in the midst of night, he would go there and steal the sign and put it up in the gallery, saying, "So here's Þingvellir, voila."
Isn't that the site of the ancient parliament?
Yes, it is. But this is just one of the critiques that you see among artists, that we have to shift the focus from how we just gaze at nature as being something to look at and be more a part of it. We have to cut out the images that we have in our minds, and we have to relive it on our own with our senses in our contemporary understanding of this merger of man and nature, right?
Can I pull in one more?
So, and
oh, sorry.
Sure.
I was just gonna say we're getting really close to having to wrap this up. So I just wanted to pull in one more question from the Q&A, because I think it speaks, Gregory, to what the question that you just posed about why aren't we seeing art like this in New York. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the art world in Iceland, and specifically the way that artists are supported in Iceland. So Justin Levesque asked this question: can we speak to the ways socially and governmentally artists are supported in Iceland to create work, and how this contributes to the way they might take more risks in their work? So I know when I was in Iceland, I learned about the pensions that are available for artists, and obviously they're not, you know, universally available, but the fact that there are lifetime pensions that some artists can get is mind-blowing. And so, you know, especially in the wake of NFTs, for example, we've been talking so much here in the States about supporting artists, or the lack of support for artists. And I have cited actually the pension system in Iceland, saying, look, there is, you know, there are alternatives out there. We can sort of broaden our horizons, open our imagination. So yeah, Markus, I would love to hear your thoughts on this question.
Yeah, it's a good question from Justin. We're not exactly Norway. We're not, you know, at the point where just everybody who says I'm an artist can just get a lifetime salary. But we have it's a pretty good system, and it's divided into two, both of which are on a competitive basis. You apply for your projects in one fund, or you apply for your monthly salary in another, and you apply for a year or 2 years at a time, and you get maybe 3 or 6 or 9 months. So you're working on a specific project, you're going to a residency, you're going to focus on this series of work for a year, and you get a salary, a monthly salary for that. So this two-way system is pretty well functioning for the visual arts. We try to apply it to other arts, music, theater, and the other fields of art, and it obviously has a very different connotation in different art forms. But for the visual arts, it works pretty well. And I wouldn't say, though, that I don't think I'd say that the fact that you get your salary or your grants from a public source would keep you away from criticizing that source. I don't think that I've seen any examples of that. People who want to critique, they do it voluntarily and loudly on full sponsorship from the state.
We only have like 2 minutes, but I want to, in those 2 minutes, I want to respond to one of the questions, but I can't respond in the way that I should because I don't know enough. But it's a question basically having to do with if new generation scholarship is being done on the Icelandic sagas from a position of feminist theory, critical race theory, and all this stuff. I can't talk about that because I simply don't know enough. However, I would really recommend to go to, I think, YouTube and find Joan Jonas, the great visionary Joan Jonas, her work Volcano Saga, because this work has everything to do with the Laxdæla saga, which some scholars suggest may have been written by a woman, but that's like really open to debate. But the female roles in that saga are just so extraordinary. Gudrun being one of the great figures in this spectacular medieval literature of the sagas. So I think that would be a good place to go. Maybe also a good way for us to close this with 1 minute to go, because that's also ending with yet another visionary artist, Joan Jonas, pioneer of video art, pioneer of performance art, who's profoundly engaged and inspired by Iceland and by its literature, and by Halldór Laxness, who also is such a great author, but who Ragnar Kjartansson is in dialogue with. So I would really go to Joan Jonas Volcano Saga and watch the whole video. Her car gets blown off the road, and it's just absolutely fantastic modern Joan Jonas interpretation of that great saga. Okay.
That's true. It's true.
It's a great work. So thank you, everybody. It's now 4 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. I'm going to go to Reykjavik in like 2 weeks. I can't wait to go.
Enough about me. Next series will be on art in America. What
No,
is
but-
the typical artist in America doing?
Yeah, that's actually, well, that's, I mean, it's too, that's too complicated to say what typical artists are doing. However, last I know we're a little, but I mean, these are one thing I have totally experienced in Iceland, cross generations, younger ones and older ones, is that in some manner, artists tend to be engaged in a profound way with their homeland, whatever that means, nature, history, identity, anger, complex things, but that it tends to be. There's a great group of artists who've worked together for a long time called the Icelandic Love Corporation. I love them, all women. They do. It's so excellent. Look at Ragnir Kjartansson's work. He's invoking specifically Icelandic things, also making fun of them as well. Sigurdur Gudmundsson as well, who should be like a household figure in the West, but is not. The earlier work I'm talking about from Sun generation time.
I think we definitely need the sequel to this talk.
Yeah, you're just starting naming names here, and what's happened next?
Thank you all so much for joining us today. And I think we're going to stick to the hour. And we will repeat this at some point, I think.
Wonderful.
Okay,
Thank you
thanks
so much for the
being
opportunity.
here. Okay, bye.
Have a nice
Bye-bye.
Bye.